What is up, y'all? Welcome to the Does It Matter for Hypertrophy tier list. So this is not going to be like squats, tier 1, leg press, tier 2, that kind of thing. It is looking at the factors on how to assess if a movement is good. So the 5 tiers are going to be not necessary, so doesn't really matter that much, rarely relevant, so sometimes it matters, but sometimes it doesn't. It's kind of important. Somewhat significant, very vital, and extremely essential. And by the way, if you disagree with any of my rankings, well then, fair enough. Let me know in the comment section below. If enough people disagree, I might even change my mind. Now, first up in the bottom tier is constant tension. Now, it's certainly not a bad thing if a movement has constant tension, but it's not something that you have to go out of your way to try to get. And in fact, a lot of the best exercises for hypertrophy don't actually have constant tension. And one of the reasons why I put this in the bottom tier is that it's something that I think is extremely overrated, and sometimes people go out of their way to try to find some exercise where the resistance is always perfect and there's constant tension. That is by and large not necessary. Number 2, modality. I got this infographic from Boney to Beastly. Damn, their SEO game is on point. They're everywhere on Google image search. So basically, modality is barbells, dumbbells, cables, bands. Basically, what is the resistance
La resistance lives on
that you are moving against? Could be a machine, could be, I don't know, some kind of weird compression device, spring-loaded something or other. This doesn't really matter that much. You can gain muscle through a wide range of modalities, and I think focusing on one at the expense of all the others is definitely a mistake. So use a wide range of implements to get the best results. Whether it's bands, whether it's rings, any other modality can get you results when used well. Next up is popularity. How popular an exercise does not determine its efficacy. Okay, there are a lot of very popular movements which actually aren't that good. Just go on TikTok and you'll see lots of movements that are very popular and are actually dog shit. On the other hand, there are some movements which are very, very effective and you just don't see very often. Next up, getting into tier 2, rarely relevant, is micro load ability. I find that this is important, but only in the extremes. So let's say you only have 5 kilo dumbbells and 10 kilo dumbbells. So they jump right from like 10 pounds to 20 pounds. That might be very tricky to do something like a lateral raise on. You might be able to do the 5 kilo dumbbells for a bunch of reps, but then you jump up in weight and you have this huge no man's land where you can't actually do the exercise correctly. And so I would say, yeah, in this case, micro-loadability is very, very important. But for most exercises, not that important. Next up, we have EMG activation. Now, I certainly think this is a factor, but this can absolutely be taken too far, where it's like, this is the best exercise, this is the second best, because EMG and nothing else. That is definitely a problem, and it's something that, I've gotten wrong in the past. I remember I've written some Quora answers where it's like, the top 5 shoulder exercises based only on EMG. I think that is a piece of the puzzle, but it's a small piece, and it certainly should not be the entire puzzle. And should EMG data impact your exercise selection? Probably not. Next up, we have the pump. Now, I certainly think getting a pump is a nice experience. It certainly feels good. It's like seeing yourself in the future. But should this inform exercise selection or which exercises are best? Probably not. I find that this is more due to your rep range and your recovery time. Those 2 factors are going to be much more important when it comes to getting a pump compared to your exercise selection. And there are some exercises that just don't ever give me a pump. If I'm doing heavy sets of squats or Romanian deadlifts, I might not really get a pump in the muscle. I mean, I'll get a little bit, but that's not really going to be an indicator of anything. And I think I'll do a whole video on the pump. I do think it is useful. I do think it's good to get a pump. It can be beneficial. But does this inform your volume decisions or your training decisions? If this exercise gives you a slightly better pump than this one, does it really get a leg up in terms of being selected? Maybe a little bit, but I would say there are a lot of other way more important factors. Next up, if something is unilateral or bilateral. So if you're doing, a one-legged leg press or a two-legged leg press or Bulgarian split squat versus a normal squat, I would say that alone is not that important. Okay, you can gain muscle with one leg, with both legs, with one arm, with both arms. I would say you should have some exercises in your program, especially for lower body, to try to at least assess imbalances and maybe to help correct them as well. But it's certainly not a huge factor of if an exercise is better for hypertrophy. Next up, stability or balance. Now this matters, but only in the extreme. As long as the implement is stable enough, I would say this is not really a factor at all. For example, ring training. It's quite unstable compared to using a barbell or sitting in a machine. But it can absolutely still be effective despite being way less stable. This is because it is stable enough to be able to produce maximum force. Your body says, okay, like we can create our own stability enough where we can still, effectively contract the muscles and activate the central nervous system. However, squatting on a Bosu ball, that's not stable enough. Okay, so it needs to have this threshold of stability, and once you are past that, I would say more stability is not going to be more effective. And a lot of these people who say that more stability or less stability is always a good or a bad thing, it kind of breaks down under argument. So if they say, oh, more stability is always better, so okay, so use a machine for everything. And if someone says, oh, less stability is better, well, why not just do everything standing on one leg with a cheetah attacking you or something like that? Or like a tiger or a lion or any large cat. It could be a bear if you want to really confuse the muscle. Next up, getting into tier 3, contraction. So this is essentially, can you feel that peak contraction? So if you're doing a spider curl, you might feel like this cramping sensation as the muscle fully shortens. How important is this? Kind of important. Actually, this could easily go in tier 4. Fuck it, let's put it in tier 4. I'm not going to update the picture though. I would say this is maybe a factor, but you definitely don't always need it. And I would say the stretch, as you'll see later, is more important. So studies have shown that the lengthened position is going to be more important for muscle growth, and that if you have to do partials, you're going to want to do them in the lengthened position. This is often more challenging, which is why people often do partials in the contracted position. So they're doing quarter squats in the top position rather than doing quarter squats in the bottom position. Next up, total muscles worked. I would say if you are a beginner or you are on a time-constrained budget, you are going to want to go for almost entirely compound movements and just keep isolations to a very small part of your training, if not ditching them completely depending on your goals. However, you can also gain muscle exclusively on isolation movements if you really want to. So I would say looking at a movement for hypertrophy, working more muscles is not always better. It really does depend on your schedule, on your preferences, and if you can progress with various movements. So typically I say, hey, do more compound movements, but this is mostly from a time efficiency standpoint. You can gain muscle from isolation, you can gain muscle from compounds. They are both good and they both have their place in your program. Next up, soreness. So are you getting delayed onset muscle soreness after your workout? I would say this is a factor and something to keep in mind, and it certainly tells you what you worked. If you're doing squats and then 2 days later, your spinal erectors are super sore and you don't have any quad soreness at all, and you're trying to work your quads, maybe not the best. That being said, a lot of people seem to think that if you're not getting sore, you are not getting a good workout. I would go way more based on progression compared to if you're getting sore, okay? Once you adapt to your workout plan in terms of the volume and the exercises and everything else, high intensity techniques, you probably won't get that sore. And so I would say chasing soreness for most people is chasing something that you probably shouldn't be chasing. Then I have compound versus isolate, which I kind of covered before. Moving on to strength and resistance curve. I would say this is, it's somewhat of a factor, okay? But only if the strength or resistance curve is like wildly bad. So you have something like a triceps kickback, nothing, pretty easy. Oh, that's really tough, okay? So if something is super easy during most of the range of motion and then suddenly gets way difficult, probably not the best movement. And a lot of people will actually, even beginners, they will self-correct if they feel a movement is super easy in most of the range of motion. For example, in a lateral raise, easy, 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 a little bit more difficult. Oh wow, way more difficult. So a lot of people will cheat. And that's what I actually do. And I actually encourage slight cheating on lateral raises because it actually smooths out that resistance curve. Next up, convenience, setup, and how many warm-ups you might need for the movement. You see some stuff on social media where it's like there's a bar attached to a string, which is attached to a rope, attached to a chain, and then you're pulling this, except it's counterbalanced by this. When I look at that exercise, I'm like, that's cool, but I'd never fucking do that, right? Like, I'm busy. I don't want to spend all day in the gym. I already, I'm doing a lot of volume. I don't want to have to set up some weird contraption. It almost looks like one of those machines where you set it and forget it, and it's just like it conserves all the energy in the system. Like Ruth Bader Ginsburg machines, or that's definitely not the right name for it. But it conserves all the energy in the system through some weird contraptions. Except in this case, it is wasting your energy. Similarly, especially if you are pressed for time and you just know that you need a lot of warm-ups on, say, squats to get your hips ready or your knees ready or lower back or whatever, that might push it down in priority a little bit. If you know you can go in and just do 3 sets of leg extensions and, just anecdotally for yourself, that is just as good as squats, and yet it is 5 times faster, that might be a consideration. Next up, the mind-muscle connection. I actually considered putting this lower because I see that it is overrated by a lot of people. They are always doing like super slow contractions, really, really mindful, ultra strict technique. Often these people stay small. Okay, I'm just observationally speaking, allowing a little bit more natural of a technique. Some people say, oh, I don't feel squats in my quads. Yeah, you're doing sets of 5. Like, you're not going to feel squats in your quads. Now, you should be squatting in a certain way if you want to grow your quads, but you still might not have the same feeling. Especially if you're the kind of person who just clears waste products, hydrogen ions really quickly, you might not get that burning sensation in your quads. For me to get a burning sensation in my quads, I have to do like drop sets on leg extensions and pretty much nothing else. Right? And that's not the best way to build big legs. So sometimes what gives you the best mind-muscle connection is shit for growth. Not always, but kind of often. All right, getting into tier 2, range of motion. This is absolutely important, and I would say when in doubt, err on the side of more range of motion rather than less. As long as you're not like taking tension off the muscles. So if you're doing, say, kickbacks, which is kind of mediocre anyway, but if you're like, oh, I gotta get more range of motion, I'm gonna start going up here. Stupid fan.
I kind of snapped yesterday at the live stream towards my fans, and I didn't like how I did that.
Well, you're definitely not getting anything more out of the movement. So you have to think about range of motion, but where you're still keeping tension on the muscle and the muscle is actually doing something. Or let's say you're doing dumbbell flies, you're going down. You could get more range of motion, right? Like if you just sort of lost tension and really just started like folded your entire upper body backwards, you could get more range of motion, but that limits your loading a lot. And I would say a lot of people just don't really have the flexibility and the mobility and the joint stability to do that safely under load. So range of motion is something that often more is better, but more than enough is not always better, if that makes sense. Another example, if you're going down in the squat and you reach end range of motion in your hips and now you're getting butt wink, I don't think that's the end of the world, but you're also not really getting more out of that in terms of lower body hypertrophy. Yet another example, let's say you want to train the hamstrings, you're doing a Romanian deadlift, you push the hips back, you go down, 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 lengthen, 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 you reach that fully stretched position, you're done. Right? Like, yeah, you could get more range of motion in terms of how far the bar moves by maybe letting the knees go forward, maybe letting the lower back or middle back or upper back round, the scapula drift forward, etc. But in terms of the muscle that you're trying to train, you're done. Which brings me to the next one, the stretch. I would say this is at least as important as range of motion, and you're really going to want to emphasize this with at least some exercises in your program. And generally speaking, if an exercise challenges the lengthened part of the range of motion more than the contracted, that is going to be better. So take something like a spider curl. There's basically no tension in that lengthened position, whereas there's a lot of tension in the contracted position. It's most challenging up here. Whereas an inclined dumbbell curl, it's kind of the opposite. It's most challenging at the bottom in that stretch position, and then there's no tension at all really at the top. I would say the inclined dumbbell curl is overall a better exercise. For biceps, hypertrophy. Next up, loadability and progressibility, which are kind of synonymous, I would say, or at least very similar. So basically, can you progress in load on this exercise in the long term? So for example, there's this chest press machine at my gym that I really, really like, right? It's very easy to set up, nice contraction, feels very smooth, easy on the joints, nice stimulus to fatigue ratio, which we'll get into a little bit later. The trouble is, I've already maxed it out for 20 reps, 20 strict, controlled reps. And after that, you can't really do anything more. There's no way to put plates on the machine or anything. It's just done. And so for me, this is no longer a great exercise because I can't really progress on it. I remember the first time I hit 20 reps on that machine, I shed a tear. It might have been sweat. It was sweat. Speaking of sweat, if you've enjoyed this video so far, I'm going to plug my own product in my own video if that's okay. You can grab a copy of my book up there. If you've gotten value from this ad-free content, you might want to check it out. I think you will enjoy it. Next up, equipment. This is absolutely essential if you don't have access to a piece of equipment, okay, it could be the best exercise ever, but if you can't do it, it's kind of shit, isn't it? For example, I really like the pullover machine. I haven't made a video on it because I know most people don't have access to it anyway, and it would kind of just be flexing, oh, I have access to this cool machine no one else has. So, not that useful. Next up, the biomechanics of the exercise. So, I've talked about this a little bit in other categories, and I do think this is important, and I do think it is worth considering how your body is moving, what are your goals, what are you trying to target, follow those fibers, etc. I don't think this is on tier 1, although to some people it is absolutely the most important thing. I think the pendulum swings in various ways to where, biomechanics isn't important at all, and now it's the most important thing. To me, it is somewhere in the middle. The exercises that you select just have to be good enough, okay? They don't have to be absolutely perfect. I see this in my gym all the time. People who are copying these biomechanics channels, some of which, I really enjoy their content, but I see it fucked up on a regular basis and done by people who probably don't even need these special exercises in the first place. Next up, injury risk. Now this one admittedly is a little bit tough to actually assess because you don't know, okay? So some people might get knee pain from squats, other people might be totally fine. It also depends on the dose, on your technique, on your program, on your sleep, on your stress, on so many other factors. And so it's difficult to say, hey, this exercise is just more injurious than this one. However, if you notice that you tend to get a lot of issues when you do a certain movement, I would say there's really no harm in just avoiding that movement. No exercise is worth getting injured over. Next up, enjoyment. Now, I initially put this on tier 1, but then I moved it down to tier 2 because I do think it's very important. However, it is not a necessity by any means. There's a lot of professional athletes who get really fucking jacked, but they hate training. I've seen some guys who it's the minute they retire, fuck that shit. Done with that. No more training for this guy. I'm just going to take my millions and sit on the beach. And so for some people, they see great results without actually enjoying their training. However, for the average person, I would say enjoying your training is probably tier 1. It's not absolutely essential, but it's pretty important, and without this, most people won't consistently exercise. Which brings me to the first one on tier 1, sustainability, okay? If you can't do something on a regular, consistent basis, you're probably not going to get a lot out of it. And so a lot of the factors below, they go into consistency and into sustainability. If you have an epic workout every once in a while, who cares, right? Like, that doesn't do much for your growth. It's what you can consistently and progressively do. Next up, joint pain. Now, this is somewhat similar to injury risk, but I would say it's just a quicker feedback. If you do an exercise and your body's like, nope, nope, fuck off, don't do that, don't do that, you should probably not do that, okay? And you can modify the movement in a lot of cases. You know, let's say you're doing an upright row and it's a narrow grip and your shoulder's like, hey, maybe don't do that, right? You can take a wider grip, you can not pull as high. Sometimes pain will actually get better. Like the first time you do it, your body's like, no, we heard this was bad, we're trying to protect ourselves. That guy with 12 million subs, he said this is bad, therefore we're going to hurt. Biopsychosocial. And so pain is not always a problem, but I do think it's something you want to listen to and probably be proactive with avoiding movements that hurt or perhaps modifying them so that they don't hurt. Next up, stimulus to fatigue ratio. Now, I would say for some people, not that important, okay? If some people are like, I don't deadlift because of stimulus to fatigue ratio. And then you're like, well, how much is your deadlift? And you're like, I rep 1 plate. You don't have to worry about fatigue, okay? So a lot of people are actually undertrained to where fatigue is really not the limiting factor, and they would do better from getting more stimulus even if it had more fatigue, even if the stimulus to fatigue ratio was worse. However, I do think that as you become stronger, as you become a more serious lifter, as you maybe get a little bit older and more advanced, I think stimulus to fatigue ratio, specifically for hypertrophy, is certainly a very important consideration. Finally, when deciding if an exercise is good for hypertrophy, the last indication, and probably more important than any, is hypertrophy. Yeah. Kind of makes sense, right? Like if your goal is hypertrophy and you want to assess an exercise for hypertrophy, hypertrophy is kind of the ultimate indicator. However, it is a lagging indicator, especially for you. So it's not like you can do a set of curls and then be like, yeah, these ones grew my biceps more. And even if you do it over the course of a month or 3 months or something like that, where you might be able to see growth, you don't necessarily know what exactly is causing that. Like, oh, is it the easy bar curls or is it the pull-ups? Like, I don't really know for sure. Still, I think that if you are diligent with your tracking and you are observant, you should probably notice some trends of what is actually giving you growth. It'll take a few years to figure out, but it's something to keep in mind. Alright, so I hope you like this video. Let me know if you have any disagreements down below. These are not set in stone, these are just my opinion, and so if you have a different opinion, let me know. Also, grab a copy of my book if you like this video. If you made it all the way through this video, you will definitely enjoy my book and get a lot of value from it. Link in a pinned comment down below, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.